Thank you very much. It's an honor to be with you, and I need to update that bio because our fourth child is now on the way. I don't know if I was supposed to announce that yet, but I'm so excited about it I can't help tell everybody. So if I decide to move to Hungary, I now know how fiscally advantageous that will be for me. I had some prepared remarks focused on the issue of euthanasia and the debate we had around that in Canada, and I will hopefully get to those, but I did want to make a few general comments in response to some of the things that have been said today and some impressions that I have from them. So there was a lot of discussion today about human rights, and this is the core of this topic, human rights, the use and perhaps occasional misuse of this concept as well. As was mentioned in the introduction, human rights are deeply important to me. They were in my mother's milk, so to speak. My grandmother was a Holocaust survivor. She was living in Germany during the Second World War. Her father was Jewish. And as a result of that experience, we were raised to have a deep understanding and appreciation of the importance of human rights and the need to speak for the voiceless. Her father, who was the fully Jewish person in the family, was able to leave before the war, and he got a visa to come to Ecuador. So thus began my family's happy relationship with this part of the world. My grandmother was forced to stay behind, and she spent a substantial portion of the war hiding out on farms. She survived, in her mind, primarily because of the bold anti-Nazi political ministry and witness of the Catholic Archbishop of the area, someone named Clemens von Galen, who's now Blessed Clemens von Galen. His ecclesial motto was Nec Laudibus, Nec Timor, which I understand means regardless of praise or criticism. And I have a big portrait of him on my wall at the office, in gratitude, of course, for his impact on my family, but also to remind me of the importance of standing up for the voiceless and for justice. Now, there are a number of things that inspire me about him. His willingness to speak for the dignity of all, including those who were not like him. He was a Catholic. My grandmother was Jewish and Protestant by confession. Nonetheless, he spoke in a way that allowed her survival. And his words about justice and human dignity inspired people of all faith traditions in the area. His actions were characterized by love for everyone in his society, and he was willing to criticize his own team. He was a proud nationalistic German, and yet he was willing to criticize the German government on issues of fundamental justice. He was a great human rights activist, and he is my model as I seek to be a human rights activist and defender in the Canadian Parliament. Now, there are what you might call heresies in the world of human rights. There are ways in which terminology is used in a direction that seems at odds with the fundamental principle of human rights. And I think one of the clearest errors that is made is when we detach human rights from what it is to be a human. That is, we lose a sense of humanness and a common sense definition of what it means to be human linked to ideas about human rights. We suggest that someone does not have their humanity or does not have human dignity in certain kinds of situations, whether that is because of their vulnerability, because of their suffering, because of their ethnic background, because of their religious background. And there are other characteristics or actions that mark individuals out for a dehumanization in different societies and different times. And these attacks on human rights, then, they do not deny the language of human rights, but rather they seek to challenge a sense of humanness, of what it means to be a human being. And so I take on as a mantra this idea of a Christian humanism. And there are some criticisms of humanism made earlier, and I would agree with the principles of those criticisms, but I would use slightly different language. I would say that what I advocate, a belief in universal, immutable human dignity, is a Christian-informed humanism, and an understanding of human rights that includes a recognition of the importance of belonging, of human identity and human rights involving membership in particular communities, like families, where we first learn to love those around us. The love of the universal is grounded in the love of the particular. Now, we've spoken today about human rights. We've also spoken about Christian values. And my challenge to all of you is to remember the words of Christ to love your enemies, even to love your political opponents, and to invite them into conversations which make them more open and more willing to hear and have conversations about your ideas. I think Christians in politics should not just be characterized by the positions they take, but the way in which they engage with others and the way in which they take those positions. Christ did not say, "They will know you are Christians by your positions on public policy issues." He said, "They will know you're Christians by your love." Some of you have perhaps been accused of being haters at different times in your political career. So let us confound those who accuse us of hate by exceeding their wildest imagination by our capacity to love. And that doesn't mean giving in, that doesn't mean weakness. Indeed, love is a strong thing. It was because of love that von Galen risked his life to speak out and defend the vulnerable in Nazi Germany. It was because of love that William Wilberforce stood against slavery, suffering greatly personally in terms of his health and other ways. Love leads us as politicians to run for office. It leads soldiers to enlist to fight injustice. It leads mothers and fathers to care for their children, even in the most difficult of circumstances. And like human rights, love also must be always tied to a proper understanding of the human person, of human dignity and also human potential. That is, love is not to be indulgent, to indulge whatever somebody thinks about themselves or their ideas, but rather love is to challenge people to a full conception of their dignity, of their value. Now, in the time I have left, let me speak briefly to the Canadian law with respect to euthanasia, and I hope there are some lessons for some of you in this room. Now, broadly speaking, the contours of euthanasia can be defined by two things: by eligibility criteria, who can get it, and by the processes that must be followed in order to get it. Things like waiting periods, the approval of experts, etc. Things you might call safeguards. Now, importantly, there are two separate things. A law can have narrow eligibility criteria, but an absence of safeguards, or wide open eligibility paired with very robust safeguards. Now, it might seem counterintuitive, but my inclination during our debate on this was to prioritize safeguards over eligibility criteria. Whether, for example, the mentally ill or people who are not terminal can access euthanasia is relatively less important than the processes you have in place to ensure that criteria are met. This is because narrow eligibility criteria are ultimately meaningless if you don't have robust safeguards. I also think that safeguards will protect more people than narrow eligibility criteria, since those who really want to die are going to find a way of killing themselves regardless. This isn't to say that eligibility criteria aren't important, simply that in politics one must set priorities. Now, the current Canadian regime, which I of course voted against, has ambiguous eligibility criteria but a total absence of safeguards. All you need is two doctors signing off. Neither of them have to be the attending physician, and there is no provision for advanced legal review of whether or not criteria are met. Now, going forward, reversing euthanasia is probably a political non-starter, but introducing proper safeguards to try to protect at least some of the vulnerable, including those who don't actually consent, is an urgent matter. Why is it urgent? Because while the current eligibility criteria imply a slight narrowing from the original court decision which forced the issue, through a requirement that the patient's death be reasonably foreseeable, nobody has ever been able to explain to me what that really means. Since legalization, we had a case of a Vancouver physician who declared a depressed person eligible for euthanasia even before examining that person, because the patient could easily get bed sores and die of infection. A person's death was, prior to examination, declared reasonably foreseeable because the person could theoretically die from an as yet uncontracted bed sore infection. This highlights the significant risk of abuse, the vulnerability of so many Canadians and others in countries where this is legal. And this should make clear how a supposed narrowing of eligibility criteria is unlikely to mean anything in practice, especially in the absence of meaningful advance review by independent and competent legal authority. In my last 1 minute, I wanted to touch on as well an issue that Uju brought up in her excellent presentation, the issue of sort of neo-colonialism in the context of development assistance. It's very important for those of us in the global north, so to speak, to hear from legislators who can share information with us about the impact of development assistance in your countries. We need to hear those stories directly from you, and this and other networks provides the opportunities for those conversations. And I'd be very interested in hearing from any of you about things you're seeing on the ground related to that presentation that may come from countries like mine. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak today, and I wish you all well in your efforts to defend human life, human dignity in all cases and forms. Thank you.